You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Paul, one of my favorite things is when Richard wears his Franciscan habit. It's like the cutest thing ever.
Yeah, you don't see him wear it very often, so when you do, it's kind of a treat.
Yeah, and it just reminds you again, like, oh yeah, Franciscanism is the ground from which Richard has drawn so many of his insights and teachings, and even evident in his whole orientation in his life and his ministry.
Yeah, that lineage, that Franciscan tradition really helps you understand who Richard is and how he's able to speak with such a prophetic and poetic voice as clearly as he does, because he is in the footsteps of Francis in that way.
Mm-hmm. In this episode, we dive into environmental awareness rooted in Franciscan spirituality, and it's a helpful lens through which we can begin to address the issues that we're facing environmentally, but from a contemplative stance that maybe tries to move us forward in making positive choices that are aware and connected to the impact that we have, but in a way that doesn't feel dogmatic or heavy-handed or judgmental toward people who maybe aren't ready to make those choices.
Yeah, and I know this is so close to our heart as parents, as we're thinking about what does healthy spirituality look like in a time of climate crisis. So I think for all those reasons and more, this is one of the most relevant and resonant, one of the most resonant conversations we have with Richard, because it's so needed now in a time of crisis just like this. So with that, enjoy our conversation with Richard here on environmentalism and the Franciscan tradition. So Richard, we've all read Eager to Love, and we love
Why do you sound so surprised?
I do. I really. So thank you.
I think part of the reason why it's made such an impact on me personally is just that it helps explain the tradition that birthed you in this way.
Yes.
And gives a deep time to your own formation, which I find personally helpful as I try to participate in the wider alternative orthodoxy that you have so well taught. And in that, you name that the early Franciscans, Bonaventure, Scotus, and obviously Francis himself, they're known for their celebrated connection to being a part of nature and this world as a mirror to which we pass over to God. And there's such a naturalness to this perspective, and yet the bulk of Christianity has seemed to pay no mind to this at all with the theology of domination over planet.
That's right.
So for me, what comes to mind is the difference in the perspectives of the shape of God. That the Franciscans were more in the practice of the wild God rather than the domesticated God who needs the AC to be set to 68 degrees. So can you add your take on the relational difference of Franciscans with God versus the dominant viewpoint that I think is the waters that we swim in right now?
Yeah, let's, because Franciscanism has always been and easily is sentimentalized. We call it birdbath Franciscanism. Mm-hmm. Let me come, and that's what Scotus and Bonaventure were trying to do, to give weight to this so it's not just sweet love of animals. So let's try what you brought up already this morning. Or did you? I don't know if you did.
Let's see, I did. It makes me sound good.
And Martin Buber made it clear. He said, basically, there's two ways of relating to reality. I, it, and I, thou.
Right.
Now, the worldview of people before transformation, before reorder, is almost always I, it. That demands a conversion to learn how to give dignity, credibility, equality, authority, use all of those words, to the other. The natural desire of the ego is to dominate it. That's the I-it relationship. The I-thou is to grant it, I know these are big words, but subjectivity. And what we mean by subjectivity, it is not objectified. Once it's made into an object for my consumption, for my explanation, for my money making, for my smart making, I understand that. How many people don't you know? You know, as soon as you start talking about something, they have to show off their intelligence. They knew that. They know all about those kind of trees. And that's fine, but that actually, knowledge is a form of the subject-object split. And how many people don't love to show off their knowledge about everything? Not that it's wrong to have knowledge of things. It's the way you do it. So the Franciscan worldview, personified in something that's sweet and sentimental, I guess, but was in Francis's first recorded use of the terms brother and sister for everything. Brother sun, sister moon, sister fox, brother air, even elements, even animals. I keep saying I just got an email this morning, but I did again, just this morning. There's someone was calling a Franciscan who writes a column in a national paper, pagan, for saying what I'm saying right now.
Wow.
For granting subjectivity, subject to subject, I, thou, letting the other speak to you. Let's put it this way, letting the other have voice. And we've done this on retreats over the years, you know, to find one object in nature, to sit before it for a while, and then journalize what that old log would want to say to you. Mm-hmm. It has led many men, also on the men's rites of passage, to tears, you know. Well, I stood here for 110 years and then I got blown down or whatever. No one notices me, but I'm sure glad you noticed me. Thank you. It's amazing how easily the words come, but first you have to grant it voice, which is to grant it some level of equality or dignity or soul, if you'll allow me to use that word. Mm-hmm. I certainly know there's a lot of people who, when you say animals have soul, they just know only human beings have soul. Why do you say that? What evidence do you have for that? You know, you haven't observed very long. You haven't been present very long. Or you'd see everything has maybe rudimentary in rocks. But what is life itself? A growing tree, a growing bush that keeps returning every spring. It's the seed is the soul of the thing. It keeps showing itself until it finally accepts this is my time to die. And usually does not fight its death. The higher you are in levels of consciousness, humans, we're the ones who fight the death. Animals, it certainly doesn't feel good, and I'm told most animals die a painful death in one way or another, but they seem to also accept it. They say they go into the woods and sit down. And where do all these herds of reindeer, and every one of them dies sooner or later, they go into the woods and sit down and die, probably a lot of pain, and they let then other animals come and eat them, and they're back in the life cycle. Mm-hmm. I have to say that's soul. Maybe not the way you talked about a soul going to heaven, but a soul who is already in the cycles of life and death, and therefore heaven. So what Francis discovered was a spirituality for this world that allowed you to delight in this world and not just to seek to escape it, to get away from it, but to find God in it and through it. I'm glad you used the word mirror, because that's the contribution Claire made, her feminine contribution, because she didn't get to wander the fields. That's all that a woman could do in the 13th century after she was an adult. The women had to live in a cloister. And maybe you've been there, San Damiano in Assisi. But it's interesting that she uses the word mirror more than anything else. That everything is a mirror. Now, she had a little garden, so maybe in a much diminished world, watching her little flowers and plants grow. And San Damiano is built like a little courtyard. It's still there exactly as it would have been when Claire was alive. She also seemed to be nature-based, and you see it in the metaphor she uses, that everything is a mirror and mirrors the Creator. So it was our contribution, but because we allowed it to be sentimentalized, and because, especially after the Council of Trent, when you dang Protestants divided from us,
You
and
jerks.
we had to circle the wagons and prove that we were right. What happened to most Franciscans is we became priests more than friars. Priests in brown robes, you understand? That's what dualistic thinking does. Once we had to prove that the Protestants were wrong and we were right, we became more company men, let me put it that way. And that lasted till, really my early years in the seminary. That's when it began to fall apart.
What's interesting to me is that this worldview, this Franciscan worldview that held relationality as the basis of the cosmos, is now being proven as absolutely correct.
It's so wonderful. Yeah.
From a scientific point of view.
Yes,
And I think about the absolute arrogance of human beings to say such things like, oh, well, animals don't feel or plants don't feel or there's no soul. And, we're finding now, the most cutting edge science around consciousness is that human brains aren't producing consciousness. Consciousness is the matrix. And so who are we to say and believe
the mater, matrix, that's right.
That we are the only ones who have this capacity. So as a point of just observation, that kind of full circle, this Franciscan worldview, which is also so Trinitarian, right? Because it allows us to offer that subjectivity just as the Trinity does, to move into a communion paradigm with all reality. Like that's actually what science is telling us is real and
so true. So true, yeah. It took us 8 centuries after Francis to say, my God, he wasn't just a poet or a sentimentalist.
Right.
Everything is relational. And the more that relationality can become conscious, which is appreciative, which is really contemplation, appreciative consciousness, not critical consciousness. And that was the trouble with the Enlightenment. It was more, which we call analysis, always critiquing everything. But what about appreciating in your observing something? That's only strongly been reappreciated itself in the last 50 years. Can you turn that on? Just the fan or something. Yeah. Thank you. In all fairness, so we don't try to take all the credit, the other strand which held on to both the Trinitarian element and the nature element, we now call Celtic spirituality.
That's right.
They had it way before we did. But isn't it interesting? They were considered a subtext, and there's a historical reason for it. You know what that is, of course, that the Roman Empire, which became Roman Catholicism, stopped at the Hadrian's Wall and didn't get into Scotland, and it didn't get into Ireland, across the Channel. And those monks and nuns and Christians had an appreciably different spirituality. You'll see it in their art. You'll see it in their... Now, they don't get everything right, because they're still, in my opinion, overly ascetic. There's still a lot of body punishment. And yet they love the earth and they love the animals and they love the seasons. But they still felt the body had to be punished. When you read the lives of the Celtic monks, they're pretty ascetical. And yet you read St. Patrick's breastplate, who is the transitional figure. He learns from the Irish, even though he's not Irish, but he was a patrician, that's his name, Patrick, from Rome. And he Romanizes the Irish church, Now it's all the councils of the church, the dogmas, the doctrines. But he still holds on to what he learned from the Irish. And you see this in his Trinitarian music and poetry. We have to believe he learned it from them, the people he was evangelizing, because that would not have been the norm in Rome at that time. We don't think.
Yeah, and it just helps me to think of those who did not immediately cut up and divide reality, but try to appreciate that wholeness before trying to understand some of the distinctions. And I'm thinking in particular about the ways it's right now in our world today. For me, some of those who are like the Wendell Berrys, the Gary Snyders, who kind of live in this rhythm of, I'm going to help tend to nature, and nature is actually going to respond in a reciprocal manner, where I'm going to grow this tree, and this tree is going to respond by shading my house, and how it is, with Gary Snyder being kind of the epitome of the practice of the wild, and what does it live to mean in relationship to the wild, with Wendell Berry, when more of an agricultural sense, and how through their correspondence and friendship, they're seeing that the wild and agriculture actually need one another to thrive. That you can't have control, but you can't have complete wildness for humanity to kind of be on its own evolutionary path. But it's in that communion between the wildness and the cultivation of land as well. And that when you remove one too much from the other, like right now, as we've just removed, so many wild species, that is actually just damaging the way that we grow food. That we need to reintroduce the ways that we're just naturally a part of the evolutionary edge into our landscapes, so that we can try to rebuild that right relationship in that communal paradigm. I
think the word relationship seems so central to this need for us to shift into this new orientation of a universal Christ Franciscan approach to life, right? Because without relationship, it does just turn into domination. It turns into...
It always does.
It reminds me of the conversation we've had about the world, the flesh, and the devil. It's like, without relationship, then we fall back into the system that is the waters we swim in, which perpetuate and teach us to just consume, use, abuse.
Yes. Yeah, and the scary thing, of course, is that I guess the Vikings were pretty abusive. I think
they were, yeah.
I think you could say that, yeah.
And yet the white men from Europe who colonized America were pretty abusive.
Yeah.
Didn't see the sacrality of the earth or animals.
Yeah.
It's just that now our ability to be abusive is 100 times more.
Yeah.
And if we don't name it and recognize it, I don't know where we're going to be 40 years from now. The signs, the objective signs are not good.
Yeah.
That your children are going to grow up in a world that has the beauty that we've taken for granted. It's sad.
It's really,
God must weep.
So zooming into some of the practical ways where we can maybe live into our values a little bit better. I was just in Spain a couple weeks ago, and I was stunned by how cheap it is to buy really high quality, fresh local produce.
Same in Mexico.
It's stunning. And it got me thinking about the relationship of food and our planet, and also systemic oppression in our country where only the wealthy can afford organic, fresh, local produce. And it's just so messed up. So how does our relationship to food communicate our relationship to the body of Christ? How can we begin to pay attention to that?
If you'll allow me, this is why I consider the Universal Christ book my most important book, if I can say that. Because what I've wanted to do all my life is extend the meaning of incarnation to all of creation. Not just the body of Jesus, but the body of the earth, which has to be the body of God on some level. It came forth from God. It was God becoming visible and material, which is why I think John's Gospel uses the generic word flesh. But we so limited and idealized the incarnation in the body of Jesus, who ascended into heaven, so sacrality was not here anymore. Now, we Catholics thought we were maintaining it, and symbolically we were in the bread and the wine. Okay, the sacred body is still here, you know. But then we even sent Mary's body to heaven. And so we were always lacking in embodiment to sacrality. But I do think it explains the Catholic obsession with the Mass. Bring the body into this world, get it here, because it isn't here. And what we're saying is, it isn't just the body of Jesus. It's the body of every animal, every bush, every tree, every water, are all the body of God. It was meant to be a different politics. It was meant to be a different ecosystem when you grant sacrality to the whole thing. You're going to walk on it differently. You're going to use it differently. You're going to respect it differently. You're going to pray differently. God isn't up there anymore. When you kneel, you're kneeling on God. You don't need to call God into this situation. It radically changes your prayer, which was the meaning of most official Christian prayers, where we pray through Christ our Lord, because we're swimming in Christ. We're swimming in the Christ mystery. So if people get what I certainly others have said better, but what I'm trying to say in the Universal Christ, it is a game changer. It really is a game, because now there is dignity to everything. And it's not our place to decide who has the presence and who doesn't have the presence, who has the dignity and who doesn't have the dignity. Oh, this is such good stuff, you know, if I can say so myself. But it's not my stuff. It's Ephesians, Colossians, the prologue to John's Gospel. It's the Gospel, which was meant to save the world. Just hear that phrase that we've all heard so often. It was meant to save the world. And all we had to do was save a few people. Fewer and fewer as history went on. So it didn't look like there was much joy. And the angels of Bethlehem said, it will be a joy for all the people. I make a lot of that all. So it still has to be, I have to believe. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just repeating myself probably.
No, I think this is so revolutionary. This teaching is
revolutionary.
So revolutionary because it impacts how we think about everything. And, you know, at a systemic level, if Christ is in all things and, you know, you're calling us to be the kind of conscious actors in, you know, in this kind of Christ movement, to pay attention, then we do have to look at things even as simple as food. And we have to look at, okay, how does this choice impact the whole? And
there you go.
And again, without succumbing to, as you were talking about in The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, without succumbing to some game of guilt, like, oh, you know, you're not doing this or I'm doing this. And, you know, without weaponizing our values against each other, the call to simplicity and to really pay attention to that devotion to the whole, I mean, we have to look at at food as one of those, maybe one of those systems too big to fail, right? That we need to pay attention to.
Well put.
Yeah, it's funny. Food has become one of those things in our little family that's really centralized in issues of food justice, because we know we are paying more for locally produced food, but we're trying to support farmers who are tending to the earth in a way that's sustainable, that's going to regenerate the soil and not just take away. And a lot of it has to do with an understanding of the universal Christ. It has to reframe how I engage in my day-to-day life, and not just interactions with people, but also with the planet as the body of Christ. And so, I mean, this is where I feel like the endless implications of trying to live into what your book is teaching us. And I think this is at the cutting edge because we are living in a time of planetary crisis that we have to reframe. Otherwise, business as usual is going to end us up with just fire and tsunamis and catastrophe.
And only the rich will be able to buy their way out of it.
Right.
The poor will die first and suffer the most.
And as you were saying in the previous episode about not being afraid to look at what needs to be criticized, to notice within ourselves as a community, like, why do we get so edgy around, when somebody says, well, what about a plant-based diet? Like, what is it that gets so defended in us that needs to be like, how dare you critique the way that I eat and what I choose to consume? But to call us as a community to pay attention to what we're afraid of being criticized, to see that as an opportunity to grow even further into these values that you're describing of devotion and simplicity and public virtue.
Universal respect. Universal.
Yeah.
And again, we're all sinning. Jesus ate fish. Once you recognize it's all an ecosystem of Christ feeding Christ until the end, that's all there is Christ feeding himself. And you'd have to say, in fairness, well, if we've extended it to the edge, then the plants are Christ too.
Right.
So it isn't just meat that makes you impure, which has always been my opinion, why Jesus doesn't make anything of dietary rules. I'm not encouraging, the wide consumption of red meat in particular, although it's helping my anemia to have a little right now.
This was really just a staged intervention to just give you
Richard, stop that.
Just kidding. No, I'm kidding. No, it's true. I think you hold it in a way that allows for, okay, let's not be dogmatic here, but let's also look at the system. Let's pay attention and let's make choices together. And that seems to be the invitation of Franciscanism too, for me anyway. Franciscan spirituality invites these little shifts for us, sometimes big shifts, to live more fully into the universal Christ. And when I was recently reading Eager to Love, you talk about Franciscan spirituality as having a home base of nature and on the road. And I wonder if you could describe these two principles and why they might actually be helpful for us today and right now as a guide for how we can live a more environmentally attuned life with less of a heavy footprint, with less of an attachment to place.
And this really hit me. I was in England visiting the Anglican Franciscans, and they have a charming little house somewhere out in the countryside of England, their mother house. And they use a lovely term for people on the road in England. They call them wayfarers. And it's much more common there. There's all over Europe, there's walking paths. We don't have them because we've idealized our notion of private property. That would never be tolerated in Austria. This is my property and you can't walk on it. There's always a path through it, So that's the world Francis grew up in and the early friars walked in. I should mention it, today's Jonathan's birthday. He's walking from Assisi to Rome with his partner today, and they've found the path, the Via Francesco it's called, that Francis walked several times from Assisi to Rome. It was a walking culture which they fit easily into. And it was a critique of monasticism. Now, this was my BA thesis, so it's a big point of mine. Why did Francis say, and this is in his first life, do not speak to me of Benedict, do not speak to me of Augustine? Was he trying to be anti-Benedictine? No, he just had to demarcate that they had gotten into, understandably, considering their period in history, the collecting of land, the fencing of land, and that's one reason the Reformation, at least in England, was so immediately successful. Some go so far to say that 3/5 of England was owned by the church and by monasteries.
Wow.
I mean, we'll go there and see the ruins. You just don't have to go far on the road. And it must be somewhat the same in Spain. Mm-hmm. The church became giant landowners. And Francis wanted us to be, in fact, his rule, we were told when we learned it, was tips for the road. How to live in relationship with nature as you observed it while you were on the road. But then Shakespeare, did I say that in the book? Shakespeare uses a phrase that most non-Franciscans don't know what it meant. He uses it in 2 of his plays. They walked like friars. Now, to walk like friars is to walk not chattering next to one another, but in a row, about 4 feet apart.
Huh.
So it was walking meditation. Mm-hmm. So you didn't fill the air with your noise, and you observe the plants and the flowers. Now, I'm sure they stopped for drink and for eating and for talk. I'm not saying it was a vow of silence, but to walk like a friar, that phrase existed or persisted till the time of Shakespeare is really telling to me that we had a different way of spiritual practice. And nature and itinerancy were at the heart of it. Now, it wasn't long. I don't want to over-romanticize it, because I would say by the end of the 13th century, we had built little friaries. They weren't nearly as big as monasteries, but we never surrounded them with farms. Mm-hmm. So we had to be mendicants. Mendico means I beg. Would the Spanish word be the same?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, doesn't matter. We were like Buddhist monks in the early period, as were the poor Clares. So we have to believe that Clare herself went out begging, which introduced them to the world, but the world in a one-down position. I don't come as a teacher, I come as someone in need, you know. I come as someone who's ready to have the door slammed in my face and watches my reaction to that. There's still countries in Latin America, I know, where the poor Clares are still mendicants. It was outlawed in the United States eventually, so we friars were quite happy to stop doing it. But can you see how it's a different social structure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very different social structure, which creates a different kind of religious life. But in all fairness, it didn't last long. Mm-hmm. It just couldn't be sustained. When you're even up to 10 friars in one house, how do you feed that many breakfast, lunch, and supper from the beggars who go out, and the people who live close to the friary got tired of their door being knocked on? You understand? It's just, we don't like vagrancy. And it was holy vagrancy. Now, what the Buddhist countries did was they made it a privilege to be able to put food in the bowl of the monk. I don't think we ever succeeded at that. We were more a bother.
Too rascally.
In my understanding. But the structure itself was magnificent, even though unsustainable.
Mm-hmm.
And the brother who tried to organize us into sustainability, whose name is now a bad name, Michael just read the book. Did he tell you about it? Elias.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Brother Elias was the 3 on the Enneagram who tried to make this thing work and built the great convento in Assisi, which held like 200 friars. This is right after Francis dies. Mm. And so he's not even buried in Assisi. You have to go to Cortona, some miles away, and you go in a little corner, Hic Jacet Elias. Here lies Elias. Huh. Nothing else is said about him. He became the villain who, at least from my orders, observation, but he loved Francis and he loved the ideal, but he was an utterly practical man. And Francis wasn't. Francis was a zealot and an idealist, but none of us could live up to him.
Yeah. Another name for everything will continue in a moment.
Many of us feel increasing anger at injustice, violence, and indifference in our world today. Join us March 14th for What Do I Do With My Anger? An online gathering featuring Richard Rohr and Brian McLaren. Learn ways of transforming anger into loving action. Inspired by Father Richard's new book, The Tears of Things. Register today at cac.org/anger. That's cac.org/anger. What does it mean to embody salt and light? In 2025, Richard Rohr's daily meditations turn to Jesus' timeless metaphor for reflecting love into the world. Amid this season of uncertainty, join us in living with trust, being salt and light. For 18 years, the daily meditations have inspired thousands of readers like you. Subscribe today at cac.org/saltlight2025. That's cac.org/SALTLIGHT2025.
And as you mentioned, Francis, and just thinking about these turbulent times where, our planet is heading, we are in the midst of crisis. And I know,
Pre-doom era.
Yeah.
That's what we're living. Consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah.
Mostly unconscious.
Mostly unconscious.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as, I have 2 little ones at home, and Brie has 2 little ones. And as we're trying to imagine raising them in this time where, our government is not addressing the issues of the climate crisis and
denying it.
The church is not being very helpful as a whole. How do you see, what does healthy spirituality look like in a time of climate crisis? Where do you see those of us in this Christian tradition? This is where I feel like Francis has so much to speak to us right now.
He does.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What do we need to pay attention to? How do we cultivate a sense of depth and groundedness in this time of the ground is shifting and shaking in ways that...
Well, and maybe some of his zealotry is needed, to a certain extent, it's like, how can we be challenged by his example? I recently, I decided to get the paper on Sundays as a way to get my news, which maybe might sound really heretical to people because you're like, well, isn't that the Sabbath? Shouldn't you be not paying attention to news that day? But my choice was so that I wouldn't be inundated the rest of the days. And there's something about sitting with the paper that I find is actually helpful in reading the news in that way. I'm a tactile person. Anyway. Recently, there were a lot of headlines about the environment, and I now have a 9-year-old who can obviously read and picked up the paper and started reading. And he started crying. And he said, what is happening? He was reading about all the animals that are extinct and on the verge of extinction.
On the verge.
And our current administration's choices around that. And he said, Mama, what are we going to do? We have to do something. We have to do something. And I felt lost. Opie agrees with me.
Opie agrees.
I felt at a loss in that moment because I also feel that. And I do feel like the choices we have ahead of us, if we're not radical about this now, we are living out of alignment with the values of the universal Christ. And so
very much so.
I think back to your question, Paul, like, how do we do this? What can we take from Francis's example and then take seriously?
How do you convict people of what is obvious? Our capacity for denial is immense. And I don't know how many hurricanes and floods and droughts it's going to take. Just like with the gun crisis, it took 3 days for the panic to begin. My God, this is becoming a way of life. And we now have some movement. Whether it'll last, we don't know. But I think it's going to have to be one hurricane after another. But the voices of money and business are so dominant in a capitalist culture. What matters is the making of money. And I'm not trying to be moralistic, I'm trying to be realistic. But any critique of capitalism, we saw it in our customer service department. We thought we would get a lot of nasty responses when I talked about gender and when I talked about, what was the other thing I thought?
Was it race?
Race, yes, race and gender. And they told me the angriest calls from people who think they're my fans. Was when I dared to critique capitalism.
Right.
Why would you feel this need to run to the defense of capitalism? Only because it's working for you. Have you taken the time to read a few books? Who is it not working for, How many is it not working for? The whole gospel hinges on some degree of detachment from your ego and your egocentricity and your self-referential reading of reality. You put the gospel in the hands of self-referential people, they will distort it on every count, on every count. The sacraments will be distorted, the Bible will be distorted, the priesthood will be distorted, ministry will be distorted, church buildings will be corrupted. It isn't worship of God or reality anymore. So many have said in poetry over the years that nature, and we've all had those moments, nature is the natural cathedral. And gosh, that's true. It's why do we need to cover that up and block it out, actually. Block it out so we could pray inside. Now, I know you were at Gaudi's monument.
I feel like we need to make an exception for him because at least he was trying to make it look like a forest.
Yes, I knew you were going to jump in.
No,
it's good. It's true. He was just, Brie was just in Barcelona recently, where Antonin Gaudi, wasn't that his first name? Yeah. He tried to make a cathedral that looked like a forest.
Yeah.
Bringing in as many natural lights as he possibly could. And how many hours did you spend there? You just keep looking and looking.
Yeah, it's stunning. It is stunning, and you do marvel at the human capacity for ingenuity and accomplishment.
Yeah.
But to also recognize, if we were to go and look at a giant sequoia, if a human being had carved that, we would be saying, what a marvel of human capacity, and yet we're cutting them down, right? So somewhere between complete despair, which I feel like I tilt into sometimes, and denial is hope. And I think, examples like Greta am I saying her name right? Thunberg?
Right.
Greta Thunberg. This young, do you know about her, Richard?
No.
This young woman
Tell
who
me.
is leading an environmental movement. She's in high school, and she started this protest that has now taken on, and so many are following her example. I think she's called an international work strike tomorrow. Is that right?
What is today? On Friday.
On Friday,
Yeah.
okay. But all that to say, in the midst of this, just as we've been discussing with every conversation, it's like in the midst of the reality that is absurd and is to be grieved, there's yet this like somethingness is trying to emerge and break through. And how can we move into that animated action and not fall into despair or live in denial? That feels like the question I'm trying to live into with my sons.
No.
That's the challenge. It probably was of every time on a different level. Earlier, people had higher rates of violence. I know that's hard to believe. But we just have higher rates of absurdity at every level. And so I can recognize why a lot of people have blocked it, have checked out. I cannot absorb that much absurdity, that much negativity, that much despair. And so for survival, they pretend it isn't happening.
They just deny it.
Right.
That this little circle of 5 people around this table is all we need to preserve. But that ain't going to work much longer.
Yeah, and I see, just being so aware of the ways that we are, rolling back some of these protections that we had
horrible
with our waters and our mountains. And I think part of this, when I feel that despair, it's almost like it just gets stuck in me. And I know, Richard, you said, if you had another lifetime, you'd want to devote it to ways of lamenting, ways of...
Oh, the liturgy of lament.
The liturgy of lament. And it seems like there needs to be, in this era of crisis, we need to have these liturgies of lament to be able to even process and accept reality and the absurdity of what's going on right now, and not let it just get blocked in our bodies.
Stuck in it. Yeah, that's.
Because then we live in that despair. We kind of hide under the covers of what reality is actually trying to show us, or we have some of the most wealthy in the world trying to figure out ways to get out of this planet and go live on another one, which seems like a whole nother way of channeling despair instead of the living that communal paradigm where we're acknowledging what's going on. So how does, if you were to offer a word or a way of inviting us into a grief ritual or lamenting, a liturgy of lament for where we're at right now as a planet, where would you help guide us, whether it's in a personal way or in a communal way?
It's really the only remaining alternative from exploding from your anger. And I, as one, am so tired of being resentful of reality and politics and the church. I just can't live that way. So I myself have to deny. The only way out is to, I mean it in the classic sense, I wish I cried easier, but is to somehow legitimate weeping. It's a way of disagreeing with it, but while fully recognizing it. We created such a liturgy in the men's rites of passage, as you would remember, Paul. And then the one I mentioned yesterday, liturgies of not knowing. Yeah, if I had another lifetime, I'd love to, give time to both of those, because they're so contrary to typical church services. Remember when I used to talk, did I? I hope I used to talk about the difference between ceremony and ritual. That ceremony affirms the status quo. Most Catholic and Protestant church ceremonies are ceremonies. And they have to hold the psyche together. Life is good, God is good, you're good. That's all we can do in a deconstructed culture. like we have now. But rituals, and this is from the professionals who give PhDs in ritual and ceremony, rituals rightly named always reveal the shadow problem. They don't concentrate on it, but they expose it. They reveal it. Like the Wizard of Oz pulling back the veil. So I use the 4th of July parade and speech and call that a ceremony, almost always. I use a loving but real protest march, or what you're calling a liturgy of lamentation, as a real ritual. Where you do ritualize the moment we're in, the reality. You're not a hateful person, but you name the garbage that's going on. Now, people who aren't used to ritual will be very afraid of that because they're not used to the shadow being named. They're not used to the shadow being exposed. And they'll say almost always, you're anti-American, you're communist, you're violent. They'll pull out any word they can. No, this is the classic meaning. Now, let me bring that home to, one ritual that persisted was Ash Wednesday as a clear example of that, where the ashes were revealed, blessed, and put publicly on the forehead. I'm owning death and my participation in death. It's one of the few rites of passage that persisted into the modern era. And it always astounds me how many people come to church on Ash Wednesday. Do they know that somehow I've got to name the shadow instead of just, happy little Jesus songs, which aren't truthful after a while. Now, we have the phrase, we proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. But that's become, an antiphon at the middle of Mass. But we really don't proclaim the death. What we've got to do is proclaim equally the death and the resurrection, the dying and the rising, as equally to be trusted and equally a part of religion. The only time I wish I were a pope is if I could...
Can we just pause that?
Let that sink in.
Is I wish I could rewrite the official prayers of the Mass to let that be known. This is what we're doing here. We're saying loss and renewal is the pattern of everything. Not just of Jesus. And we keep worshiping it in Jesus and offering this sacrifice to God the Father of Jesus' death and resurrection. Whereas what we're doing, and that is said too, we're offering our deaths and our resurrections too, which means we have to trust both of them. Yeah.
And part of that resurrection piece to me that just came to mind was also being able to delight in just the beauty of this world too. Even as we know everything is in change, everything's in motion, everything is dying, everything is being reborn. But I just had this flash of an image of I had a beer with a dear friend a week ago, and we were almost just giddy with the delight at the sunset, and that we were together experiencing that. And it was just allowing the beauty of the moment to also have its say too, and not get only caught up in the death that we're witnessing.
That's lovely. Yes. Yeah.
And that seems to also be like a part of our friends. I said our. Do you appreciate
that? That's all right. I'm happy to have you say it.
The Franciscan that I am. But the heritage of Franciscanism is that thisness, the haecity. Am I saying that right?
Haecity.
Of
thisness.
Of being able to appreciate beauty and particularity. And I'm thinking of your gardening, Richard. The fact that for how many years now you've kept this
21 years
sweet little garden, and it's an image that's so burned in my mind when I think about you, because as we consider how we can live in the tension of our times and how we're being called to live into the universal Christ in the midst of an environmental crisis, I really appreciate that orientation, Paul, that you've offered us to say, and turning toward beauty and cultivating presence that can have awe and wonder. That, learning the names of 25 bird songs and tree species, having that kind of intentionality is doing something. And it does put us in relationship with the world in a new way.
Yeah. Yeah, it allows for the complexity, right, of the beauty and the despair to just be. It's almost like that Celtic or that Franciscan vision of the wholeness. Well, let's not divide it. Let's just hold it.
Hold it. Both the dying and the rising.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Like even now, the later days of September, I'm letting my garden go to seed. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to do. Oh, here we go again. How many times have we done this? I didn't have a big garden this year at all, but there's something sad about the dying, that I can't sustain these flowers, I can't sustain this plant.
Well, Richard, as we close this episode, I wonder if you could share with us an experience that you've had this week of sort of turning toward that delight and awe and wonder of creation as a source of recognizing the Christ-soaked world and the hope of what may yet be.
I've been having it a lot. It's just been so easy to pray the last few days. Part of it is because I'm slowing down and not traveling. I'm more a hermit at home than I ever was in my life, where I had to go off, leave the city to live in a hermitage. But by saying no to more and more speaking engagements, and having this cute little dog who's biting Corey's fingers right now,
Little Opie.
he leads me into it. I have to take him out. And I just noticed in this little yard behind me, all the different clovers and grasses and little seeded plants that make up the lawn. From a distance, it looks like one uniform green. You get close and you look at it. And of course, he has to pee on any plant that's at all tall. It just makes me observe both the time element, that I have more time than I used to have, and the space element, the space of my own yard. And I said that to someone who was walking with me while we walked Opie. I don't need to go to the Grand Tetons. I really don't. If this makes me delightful, I've been to the Grand Tetons and they're grand. But if I can get excited, which I do, about this little seedling, this little, there's some that is almost mat-like, creating a little bed. I don't know, those little things make me happy now, really happy. And I'm not saying that because you asked the question. And I wish I started being that way, but I got too busy all the way from, 30 to 70. And now I'm free to go back to that, to not need to be in special places or cathedrals. In fact, churches really bore me anymore because they're always blocking this out and saying this space is holy in here. That's a lethal statement, because if this place is holy, then that place outside is not holy. And I know we have to do it. I don't want to be unrealistic. But the church where I have Mass, this big barn of a church on this corner, isn't very pretty at all. And I don't think there are any clear windows. It's all covered with stained glass, not even very nice stained glass at that. But we tried. That's That's what we thought it was supposed to be.
Yeah, it's such an invitation for us, though, to also to slow down.
Yeah.
To live the kind of intentional lives that don't give in to stress and busyness and the world's notions of success in order to be in relationship with this blade of grass and this particular yard and this tree.
Yeah, this morning I was taking out my recycling, that annoying sound of the wheels against rock and gravel. And I was holding my son, who's almost a year old now, and I'm trying to balance both, and I put it up on the curb for the recycling truck, and I look up and there's the moon.
Oh,
And I was able to just have a pause in the midst of that busyness to delight in the fact that I'm holding my baby boy and we're just together looking at the moon. And that's what I feel like part of the gift of having that awareness, Richard, to those little things is then you can pause in the midst of the chaos.
Almost the littler the better.
Yeah.
Although the moon isn't little, but it's a little thing to notice it. Because we take it for granted. Now, did you point it out to him?
Yeah.
Yes, the moon, you said.
The moon, there it is, watching over us.
He's going to get a different religious education. And I know Brie does this with her boys, too.
Well, thank you, Richard.
Yes, thank you, Richard.
Thank you. And while you were saying that, Opie was licking my hand, weren't you? Weren't you licking my hand? Blessing it with holy water.
Oh, Opie. Well, should we look at some listener questions?
Let's do it.
Thank you for taking my question. So you spoke, Father Richard, in the Universal Christ about the earth being the first incarnation, the first Bible, as you drew from Romans 1:20. My question is, how do you continue to eat animals, or how do we not promote a plant-based diet when eating animals and animal agriculture causes so much destruction to our planet and contributes to climate change? As is the violence committed to the animals that when we eat them and kill them. Might you consider a plant-based diet or discussion of that as we continue to explore the sacredness of our earth? Thank you so much.
Thank you for having the courage to make such a proposal. I think it has much merit and addresses so many of the questions we're trying to address today. But I also note that Jesus never emphasized any dietary rules because he saw that what had happened in his own Judaism and frankly in other major world religions this was where people were most likely to become legalistic and judgmental. You could not eat with people who ate this or even touch that. The dangers of that are so huge of creating a superiority system that I think I would trust Jesus on that limiting but allowing is the more compassionate response. Now, we can go a long way toward the limiting. I surely agree with that. We had a nutritionist come. Did she come when you were an intern, Paul, that woman who taught us about...
On the 9-day interns?
Yes, you remember that. And if you remember, she said she really thought the ideal diet among the world's cuisines was the Chinese. Little flecks of meat because very often the body does need the amino acids. I know recently I found out that I'm anemic, and if you've seen me with more energy the last few weeks, that's one reason. It's just been wonderful. Now, who am I to allow little animals to be killed so Richard can overcome his anemia? I don't know, you might disagree with me, but that's part of the ecological sharing of life and death that we call the Paschal Mystery. That death is not the worst thing in the world. Now, should all killing of animals be done in a much more humane way than we now know it's done? And should their life be allowed to live in free range instead of horrible little cages all their lives? Boy, I'm with you on that. I mean, many animals, especially those being raised for our consumption, live a horrible life and experience a horrible death. There's no room for disagreement, I don't think, if you're a compassionate person.
And I think what you're bringing out too for us is just the recognition that we're still learning about this.
Yes.
We're growing together as a community. We're learning about how our choices in how we eat impacts the environment and the whole. And so I thank you for your courage and your example and your commitment. And I think in many ways we need more people to lead us to that place of recognition and seeing the relationality of the whole and how our choices impact the whole.
Yeah. And I know I've mentioned before, I've had a couple chickens and one did pass away, but we have one left. Josh is what my daughter named him, or her, I should say. And, but it's funny because the relationship between us and Josh does not produce eggs. Josh is just hanging around, and it's a different dynamic with an animal.
It must be lonely too, isn't
and
it?
It's lonely, and it feels connected to this question of like, how are we in best relationship with this chicken? And it's all trial and error, right? It's trying to learn how to be a healthy part of an ecosystem that is very, very tricky, especially now as we've shifted how we eat and how we feed animals. All right, this is the last one for environmental awareness.
Hi, Richard, Brie, and Paul. Thanks so much for this podcast. I've learned so much and also found a Christian perspective that really fits with how I've always seen the world, but wasn't sure I was supposed to. My question is basically, how do we live and thrive and help in the world today with all the problems and destruction we see? I'm particularly thinking of the natural worlds where I've always found God and the startling realities of climate change and loss of biodiversity. My understanding is that Jesus taught us not to be anxious and to trust God. And Brie mentioned that the world needs non-anxious presence now more than anything, which I agree with. But how do we find that place when we are hearing and seeing the destruction of our beautiful planet and the mistreatment of the animals and people who live here? How do we stay motivated to help and not shut off to what's going on around us while not going crazy and enjoying our lives? Is God going to help us figure this out? What should we be doing? Also, is there a way of seeing God in highways and oil fields and other man-made things? I should mention, I recently brought a beautiful little girl into the world, so these questions are even more pertinent. Thank you very much.
I'll kick this one off. I feel that sense of that maternal concern of, yes, I understand I'm supposed to be non-anxious and that is needed, but there's also an urgency to this problem that is inviting us, or that we have a responsibility toward, to act and to do something, to participate in some way. And so what I'm hearing in this question is the desire to walk that tension of being a non-anxious presence in action. And how would you answer that, Richard? How would you describe specifically to the environmental concerns that we are facing now, and those of us who are parents and are seeing the realities that our kids are going to face and are horrified by it?
Yeah, too much emphasis on non-anxious presence could well be understood as largely passivity.
Right.
That false understanding of peace of mind, keep my personal peace at all cost. I mean, it's no accident that 3 of the books being written these days, or read these days, has the word collapse in them. There's an urgency right now. And I don't think the world is going to just be impressed by people who've at all costs maintained their inner peace. But enough of it so that you can enter into the urgent with love and with patience. Let's just limit those 2 virtues, love and patience. When you can no longer be loving and patient inside the urgent, then you got to go back and do more work. But we're not telling you not to enter into the urgent, because we're on the edge of collapse politically. Western democracies seem to be falling apart. The admiring of dictators all over the earth. We're on the edge of collapse in terms of the planet. I mean, people are now stretching it to say it's 10 years, that it's getting that real. And you who have children must, oh my God, what are your little kids going to grow up in? Mm-hmm. And for those of us who are Christian, the collapse of what we thought Christianity was all about in every one of our denominations. Mm-hmm. Unless they descend to this false conservatism and false piety that ignores all political, social realities, those churches are growing. But if you allow intelligence in your church, you're probably not growing now. Mm. It shows how much order resents disorder. The prevailing worldview doesn't like critique. And so we've got our problems. Mm. And this is no longer pushing the panic button. This is no longer a conspiracy theory. The world is in trouble. Serious trouble, it seems to me. And urgent trouble. I mean, the fires in Australia are making it very real. Fires that look like they could, burn down a civilization. Yeah. Wow.
I've been thinking a lot lately, Richard, on the relationship between contemplation and creativity, and how maybe we can understand a non-anxious presence not as a static state, but the conditions from which we can be creative about the problems in our world.
I like that.
So that we're not in reactivity we're not freaking out. We haven't lost our presence. Because in order to create something new, we have to be embodied and centered and connected to the source in a way to say, God, help us. Help us create a new solution to this problem. Help us find a way to salvage this planet. Mm-hmm. We have to be present people to be able to be channels for that kind of healing force in our world.
Mm-hmm. And when you say that too, what comes up for me, I think about you're not dismissing the chaotic times we live in either. It's a full acknowledgement of the spectrum of the grief of what is occurring, but also the joy of what's still being experienced. And you have to hold both.
Yeah.
And I think about that for myself when I put my kids to bed at night, and just my prayers for them have become those anguishes to be creative healing agents in the world, because I don't know how else to pray for them.
Yeah.
Please, God, be with them as they face these tsunamis, these fires, these unknowns.
And that's part of our calling as parents right now. I find it, just as we transition into this new year, I sat down with my kids and I said, all right, we need a mission statement.
Did you really?
I did. And so we decided our mission statement is that we seek to be we seek to be kind, courageous creators, learning how to take care of the earth and each other.
That's lovely.
And it was that like, okay, we're trying to be creators. We're trying to help solve and heal and participate in. And that takes courage, and that's not going to be easy. But there's hope in that. There's hope in saying we can do something about this. I hope we can.
Well, those pictures you recently sent of your two little boys, their eyes are just so clear and bright. You just hope nothing ever dims that and fills it with cynicism. I guess all parents see that in their children's eyes. The expectation is it's going to be wonderful. You have to have that, at least at the beginning.
And that's it for today's episode of Another Name for Everything with Richard Rohr. This podcast is produced by the Center for Action and Contemplation, thanks to the generosity of our donors.
The beautiful music you're listening to was brought to you by Will Reagan. If you're enjoying this podcast, consider rating it, writing a review, or sharing it with a friend. to help create a bigger and more inclusive community. To learn more about Father Richard and to receive his free daily meditations in your electronic mailbox, visit cac.org.
To learn more about the themes of the Universal Christ, visit universalchrist.org. From the high desert of New Mexico, we wish you peace and every good.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.